I have buried one master and served another, and in between the two I watched a will read aloud that undid a young woman's entire understanding of her future in the space of 9 sentences. That is my excuse for beginning here, at the reading, rather than at the beginning of the story proper, because nothing that came before it mattered half so much as what happened in that cold library at Thornfield Grange on the afternoon. The old Earl of Thornfield finally stopped fighting his illness and let it have him. My name is Abel Fitch. I have been valet, then steward, then something closer to conscience in livery to Julian Ashworth, His Grace the Duke of Wexmoor, for 19 years, since he was a boy of 18 burying his own father, and I was a footman of 3 and 20 too green to know what grief looked like on a face that refused to show it. I tell you this so you understand I was in the room. I am always in the room. It is, I have come to think, the entire purpose of a good steward to be present at the hinge points of another man's life and say nothing until he asks. The library at Thornfield smelled of beeswax and dying fire, and old Earl Thornfield's solicitor, a dry stick of a man named Prout, read the will in a voice pitched for a much larger room. Miss Cassandra Hale sat very straight in the chair nearest the hearth, both hands folded over the silver head of her cane, and did not once look toward my Duke, who stood at my shoulder near the door as though he had wandered in to check the weather and been detained. To my ward, Miss Cassandra Ann Hale, Prout read, who has been these 11 years the whole of my family and the better part of my comfort, I leave the sum of £4,000, my books, and my blessing, freely given and never to be construed as a debt she must repay by marrying wherever I point her. A small sound left Miss Hale then, not quite a laugh, not quite a breath let out too fast. I saw her knuckles whiten on the cane's silver head before they eased again. She had, I would learn, spent 11 years listening to men admire her mind at dinner and her modest fortune in private, and then watching those same men discover, invariably within a fortnight, some pressing business in another county, the moment they understood her leg had never fully recovered from the fever that took it in her 9th year. She had stopped expecting anything from a room full of listening men. I understood that the moment I saw her face, not bitter, only braced, the way a soldier braces for a sound he has heard too many times to flinch at any more. As to the entail, Prout continued, and here his voice changed, took on the particular carefulness of a man about to say something that will cause a stir, the whole difficulty of Thornfield's succession being well known to those present, I have set down in a codicil, not a command but a request, that His Grace the Duke of Wexmoor, whom I have known since he was carried into this house in his father's arms, and whom I have watched become a man of sense in a county sadly short of them, give consideration to Miss Hale as a wife. I do not command it. I have no power to command it and would not use such power if I had it. I only say what I believe, that these two people, whom I have watched from a distance for years with more attention than either of them has ever suspected, would suit each other better than either has permitted himself to imagine. That is all. It is a suggestion from a dying man who has earned, I hope, the right to make one. The room went very still. Miss Hale's chin lifted a fraction, color rising along her cheekbones, not maidenly confusion, I thought, but something sharper. Fury, perhaps, at being made a subject of discussion in her own guardian's death, however gently framed, or fury at hope, which is a more dangerous thing to a woman who has trained herself out of it. My Duke did not move. That is the thing about Julian Ashworth that no drawing-room in the county has ever properly understood. His stillness is not coldness, it is control, and the two are as different as a locked door and a wall with no door at all. I have stood beside him at his father's graveside, and at the reading of contracts that would ruin lesser men, and I know his stillness the way a sailor knows weather. This stillness had something underneath it I had not seen before. I would call it, now that I have the years to look back and name it properly, the stillness of a man being handed, without warning, permission for a thing he had long ago decided was not his to want. Prout folded the will and looked between them with the mild curiosity of a man who has delivered his lines and now wishes only to go home to his dinner. Miss Hale rose, carefully, one hand finding the cane's head, the other braced a moment on the chair arm, a motion so practiced it had lost all self-consciousness, though I noticed how her eyes flicked toward my Duke as she did it, checking, I supposed, whether he would look away as the others always had. He did not look away. He watched her rise with the plain attention a man gives to something he finds worth watching and said nothing at all, and I thought, here it begins, whatever it is. She left the room first. That was her right, and her habit, I would learn, to leave before anyone could decide for her whether she needed help doing it. Outside in the frost-hard drive, waiting for the carriage to be brought round, my Duke finally spoke, more to the grey sky than to me. He has made a fine mess of things, Fitch. Has he, your grace? A dying man's whimsy dressed up as a will. The county will chew on it for a month. He drew his gloves on, finger by finger, a habit of his when he wanted his hands occupied while his mind went elsewhere. She'll hate it. Being handed about like a parcel with my name on the direction. You might ask her, your grace, rather than deciding it for her. He looked at me then, and there was something almost startled in it, as though I had suggested he try walking on his hands. Ask her. It has been known to work with women, even duchesses to be. I said it lightly, because that has always been my method with him, to say the true thing in a voice light enough that he can pretend, if he likes, that he did not hear the weight in it. He did not answer, but he did not tell me to be silent either, which from Julian Ashworth is very nearly an admission. I should say something here of what I had watched, over the 2 years prior, without either of them apparently noticing that I watched it all. My Duke had encountered Miss Hale first at a county assembly he attended only because duty required it. The Duke of Wexmoor did not, as a rule, dance, and was known throughout 3 counties for a reserve so complete that mothers of marriageable daughters had largely given him up as a bad investment of effort. But he had stood near enough to Miss Hale that first night to hear her demolish a pompous baronet's opinion on the corn laws with 3 sentences and a raised eyebrow, and I had watched something shift in his face that I had not seen there since before his father died. He did not approach her. He never approached her, not once in 2 years of assemblies and dinners and the small overlapping orbits of a county's gentry. He watched her from the edges of rooms, the way a man watches whether he has decided is not for him to walk in. I asked him once, carefully, over the brandy after a dinner at which he had spoken exactly 11 words to her and 40 to her guardian, why he did not simply talk to the woman. She has had a parade of men discover urgent business elsewhere the moment they learned of her leg, he said, and I will not be one more name on that list, pretending interest I do not feel simply to prove myself different from the others, and then vanishing regardless when the real courting starts. If I speak to her, Fitch, I want it understood I am not doing her a kindness. I have no patience for men who mistake pity for love, and inflict it on women fool enough to accept the substitution. And do you feel interest, your grace, or are we speaking hypothetically? He had looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Bring the carriage round," which was as close to an answer as I ever got from him on the subject, until the will changed the shape of what was permitted to be said aloud. The old Earl died 11 days after the reading of his will, which surprised no one, least of all himself. He had, Miss Hale told me much later, spent his final lucid week making calm, practical arrangements for his own funeral with the same dry humor he'd brought to everything else, and had said to her, the night before the end, "I have done one more useful thing before I go, my dear, whether you thank me for it or curse me. I rather think it will be both, and in that order." He was buried on a gray Thursday under a sky that could not decide on rain, and it was at the funeral breakfast afterward, in the long cold dining room at Thornfield with its shrouded portraits, and its smell of black crepe and over-brewed tea, that my Duke finally did the thing I had begun to think he never would. He crossed the room to where Miss Hale stood a little apart from the cluster of mourners and neighbors, who did not quite know how to speak to a woman newly orphaned of her only family twice over, once by blood and once by guardianship. She was watching the room the way I imagine a general watches a battlefield he has already lost several times before, not without hope, but without illusions either. "Miss Hale." He said it plainly, no bow deeper than courtesy required, no softening of his voice into the gentle murmur people reserve for the grieving or the infirm, both of which she had every right to be called that day and neither of which, I understood even then, she wished to be treated as. "I would speak with you, if you can spare a quarter-hour from the business of being condoled at." Something crossed her face, surprise, and beneath the surprise, a wariness so old it had become armor. "You would speak with me, Your Grace, or you would deliver a proposal your solicitor has already drafted, on the strength of a paragraph in a dead man's will." "I would speak with you," he said again, unbothered by the bluntness, or perhaps pleased by it. I could not then tell which, though I have since learned it was the latter. Whether anything comes of the speaking is a separate question, and one I do not propose to answer before we've had the conversation. She studied him. I have rarely seen a woman look at a duke the way Cassandra Hale looked at mine in that moment, not fluttering, not calculating what his title might buy her, but assessing him the way she might assess a horse she was asked to buy sight unseen, alert for the lameness nobody wants to mention until the money's changed hands. "Very well," she said. "The morning room. It has the advantage of being empty and the disadvantage of a very ugly carpet, which I have never had the authority to replace and now, I suppose, briefly do." They walked there together, and I did not follow, though I confess I found reason to be in the passage outside within a few minutes, ostensibly seeing to the disposition of the mourners' carriages. A steward's discretion has limits, and mine has always stopped somewhere short of missing the important scenes entirely. Through the door imperfectly latched, I heard the shape of it if not every word, his voice low and even, hers sharper, quicker, throwing something back at him that made him pause before he answered. "I am not a project, Your Grace, nor a debt owed to a dying man's affection for your father, if you have come here out of some notion of duty." "I have come here," his voice, cutting across hers without heat, "because I have watched you for 2 years demolish every fool who underestimated you, and I have wanted in that time to be the one person in the room you did not have to demolish. That is not duty, Miss Hale. I do not know what you would call it. I have not had much practice naming it, having never felt obliged to before." A silence then. I held my breath in the passage like a boy caught listening at a nursery door. "That is a very fine sentence," she said finally, and there was something unsteady under the dryness of her tone now, for a man who has said perhaps 50 words to me in 2 years. "I am aware it is unfair of me to arrive at fluency only now. I had my reasons for silence, which I will tell you if you wish to hear them, though I warn you they do not reflect especially well on my courage." "I have time," she said. "The Earl left me a great deal of it, along with the £4,000 and the books." I did not hear the rest, because Mrs. Prout, the solicitor's wife, came bustling down the passage asking after the tea things, and duty reclaimed me. But I saw them emerge some 40 minutes later, and though neither wore anything so simple as a smile, there was a different quality to the air between them, not settled, not resolved, but no longer entirely guarded either, like two people who had put down some of what they carried, if not all of it. That was the first conversation. It was very far from the last, and further still from the easiest. The difficulty, as I came to understand it over the following weeks, was not that Miss Hale doubted my Duke's sincerity. She was too clear-eyed a woman to mistake plain speech for flattery, but that she doubted her own right to want what he was offering. She had spent so long being the reason men left that she had built her entire adult character around not needing them to stay. To let herself want the Duke of Wexmoor, and want him not as a rescue from spinsterhood, but as a man she found, against every precaution she'd built into herself, genuinely dear, that required her to disarm 11 years of careful fortification. And she was not a woman who disarmed anything quickly or without inspecting every stone of the wall first. He courted her in those weeks in a manner that scandalized absolutely no one and satisfied absolutely everyone who watched closely, which was fewer people than gossip would have you believe, since most of the county was far too busy speculating about the will to notice the actual courtship happening in plain sight of it. He came to Thornfield. She had elected to remain there, in the dower cottage on the grounds that Prute had confirmed was hers for her lifetime under the terms of the will, rather than remove at once to some relation's charity 3 times a week. And each time he came without flowers, without poetry, without a single one of the small theatrical gestures that men perform when they wish to be seen courting rather than to actually court. Instead, he brought account books. I do not exaggerate. On his second visit, he arrived with the Wexmore estate ledgers under his arm, a thing that made Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper who had known Miss Hale from girlhood, nearly choke on her tea when she heard of it below stairs. "Ledgers," she said to me, scandalized and delighted in equal measure. "The man brings the poor girl ledgers as if she were his man of business." But I had seen Miss Hale's face when she opened them, and I understood what my Duke understood, which Mrs. Dunmore, for all her affection, did not. That Cassandra Hale had spent 11 years running a household and nursing a dying man and being treated, by every suitor who'd ever called, as an ornament to be pitied rather than a mind to be consulted. He had brought her the actual, unglamorous truth of Wexmore, its debts, its tenant disputes, the long slow rot in the east wing roof that no one had yet found the money to fix, because he wanted a wife who would run that estate beside him, not a bride who would decorate it. "You want my opinion on your drainage," she said to him, the first time, with an expression I am told by the housemaid who brought the tea tray was somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of delight. "I want your opinion on everything," he said, "beginning with the drainage because it is the least romantic subject I could think of. And I did not wish you to imagine I was attempting to charm you into anything before you'd had a fair look at what marrying me would actually require of your mind." "That is either the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him, "or the most. I find I cannot yet decide which." "Take your time deciding," he said. "I find I am in no hurry, now that I have finally begun." I report this conversation as it was related to me, since I was not present for it, but I have heard it enough times since, from Miss Hale herself, in later years, told with the particular fondness of a woman recounting the exact moment she began to fall, that I trust its accuracy. There were harder conversations too, and of these I was witness to at least one, because my Duke asked me to remain in the room, a request so unusual from him that I noted it particularly. It was a wet afternoon in the Thornfield morning room, the ugly carpet underfoot, and Miss Hale had just set down her tea with a precision that told me, after 19 years of reading such precisions, that she was steadying herself for something. "I must ask you a plain question, Your Grace, and I would have your steward as witness to the answer, since witnesses seem to matter in this business of wills and proposals." She looked at me, and there was no discomfort in it, only the deliberate act of a woman arranging her evidence. "Mr. Fitch, you will forgive me for using you as a notary." "I am honored to serve in whatever capacity is required, Miss Hale," I said and meant it. "My question, Your Grace, is this. You have spoken to me of ledgers and drainage and tenant disputes, and you have spoken once of watching me for 2 years, a claim I have not yet decided whether to be flattered or unsettled by. What you have not spoken of, in all these weeks, is my leg. I have watched you not look at my cane the way other men do not look at it, which is a different thing from not noticing it at all, and different again from truly not minding it. I would know which of the 3 this is, because I have built a life around the second kind of man leaving me eventually, and I have no patience left for pretending the third kind exists when it does not. The room was very quiet, rain against the glass. I watched my Duke set down his own cup and take a moment, not a performed moment, but a genuine one, the kind a man takes when he wants to answer with precision rather than reflex. "I have noticed your leg since the first assembly I ever saw you at," he said. "I noticed it the way I noticed the color of your eyes and the particular way you dismantle fools, as one fact among the many facts of you, none of them more or less true than the others. I do not fail to see it, Miss Hale, and I will not insult you by pretending I do, because a man who claims not to see a thing that plainly exists is a man who has not looked at you closely enough to be worth marrying. What I do not do is mistake it for the whole of you, or for a misfortune requiring my charity to offset. You are not a woman I would be doing a kindness by marrying. I have neither the patience nor, frankly, the saintliness for charity marriages, and I would be a poor liar if I claimed otherwise. I want a partner who will tell me when my drainage plans are foolish and my temper is worse. Your leg has nothing to do with either qualification, so far as I have observed." Miss Hale did not answer at once. I saw her jaw work, once, the way a person's does when they are holding something back that threatens to become tears, and I saw her master it because mastering things was, I had come to understand, the central discipline of her entire character. "That," she said finally, "is the first time in 11 years anyone has answered that question without apologizing for asking it, or for answering it, or for existing in the same room as the question at all." "I find apology a poor substitute for honesty," my Duke said, "in this matter and most others." "Mr. Fitch," she said, turning to me with a composure that had a tremor just beneath it, "you may tell anyone who asks that the Duke of Wexmore gave a plain answer to a plain question, and that I found it satisfactory." "I shall consider it my most important duty this month, Miss Hale," I told her, and I confess my own voice was not perfectly steady either, though a steward's business is to notice such things in others and disguise them thoroughly in himself. It was not, however, the end of the difficulty, only the clearing of the largest stone from the wall. There remained the smaller stones, and one in particular that I did not learn of until later, when Miss Hale told me herself, some years on, over a Christmas fire at Wexmore with her first child asleep upstairs and her second not yet born, that on the night after that conversation she had lain awake turning over not whether my Duke's regard was genuine, which she had come by then to believe, but whether she had the courage to accept a life so entirely different from the quiet, resigned one she had spent 11 years building for herself. To marry the Duke of Wexmore was not merely to marry a man. It was to become a duchess, to run a great house, to be watched and discussed and measured by a county that had never quite known what to do with her, and would now have far more reason to try. She had built her contentment, such as it was, on expecting little and being surprised by less. Wanting this much, and this particular thing, terrified her more than any suitor's abandonment ever had, because abandonment she knew how to survive. She did not yet know how to survive being chosen. She told him as much in the end, on a walk through the Thornfield garden some 3 weeks after the funeral, the frost still on the last of the autumn roses, and her cane leaving small precise marks in the gravel beside his measured stride, which he had, I noticed on the several occasions I observed them walking, adjusted without comment to match her pace exactly, neither hurrying her nor making a show of restraint. "I am afraid," she told him, "and I dislike admitting it, because fear has never done me any good and I have generally found it more useful to simply proceed without it. But I will tell you plainly, since you have been plain with me, I am not afraid that you will leave, your grace. I have come to believe you are not the leaving kind. I am afraid of wanting this, you, Wexmore, the whole enormous, unlikely shape of the life you are offering, because I have never let myself want a particular thing this much before, and I do not know what sort of woman I become if I let myself, and it turns out badly after all." My Duke stopped walking. I was some yards behind them, ostensibly examining a hedge that required no examination, and I saw him turn to face her fully, there in the gray autumn light, the roses gone brown at their edges behind him. Then let me tell you what sort of woman I have watched, for 2 years, from the edges of rooms I had no right to stand at the edge of, hoping you would not notice me noticing you, because I did not think a duke's attention would be any less unwelcome to you than a baronet's or a squire's, if it came wrapped in the same pity. I have watched a woman who runs a dying man's household with more competence than most stewards I have employed, who has read more of the actual content of her guardian's ledgers than any of his solicitors credit her for, who dismantles pompous fools at dinner with a precision I have rarely seen matched by men twice her age and half her wit, and who has never once, in all my watching, asked for anyone's pity, though God knows this county has been free enough in offering its cruder cousin, contempt. Disguised as concern, that is the woman I am asking to marry me, Miss Hale, not a fragile thing I must handle gently for fear of breaking her. A woman I expect to argue with me at length over drainage and win at least half the arguments, because I have found, in my admittedly limited experience of wanting anything this badly, that half is a very fair proportion for a marriage to run on. She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I had not yet heard from her in all the weeks I had observed this slow, careful courtship, and it seemed to startle her as much as it did the pair of jackdaws that scattered from the yew hedge at the sound. "You have been rehearsing that speech," she accused him, though there was no real accusation in it. "I have been rehearsing it for 2 years," he admitted. "I simply lacked, until recently, the permission to deliver it." "The Earl's will." "The Earl's will," he agreed, "gave me nothing I did not already feel, Miss Hale. It only gave me leave to say it aloud without wondering whether I was inflicting an unwanted duke upon a woman who had quite enough uninvited attention already. That is the whole of what that paragraph in his will did. It did not manufacture a feeling. It only unlocked a door I had already been standing in front of for 2 years, too well-mannered or too cowardly to knock." She was quiet a long moment, studying him with that same assessing look I had seen her turn on him the day of the funeral, though it had softened considerably since. "I have spent 11 years being left, Your Grace, by men who discovered, always at some point after the second or third meeting, an urgent errand elsewhere. I find I have very little practice in being stayed for. You will have to be patient with me if I mistake it at first for something that has not yet happened to me before and does not seem entirely believable." "I have patience in abundance," he said. "It is very nearly the only virtue I possess in any quantity worth boasting of. Ask my steward if you doubt me. He has watched me exercise it against tenants, magistrates, and my own temper for the better part of 2 decades. "Is this true, Mr. Fitch?" she called back to me, and I confess I had not expected to be drawn so directly into the scene I had been trying so hard to observe unnoticed. "It is entirely true, Miss Hale," I said, coming forward a few steps, since there seemed no further use in pretending distance. "His Grace is the most patient man of my acquaintance in every matter except his own comfort, which he disregards entirely and consistently, and his own happiness, which he has, until recently, disregarded rather more thoroughly than I ever thought wise to permit." "There," she said to him, "a character reference from a man who has known you 19 years and has, I think, no motive to flatter you beyond simple loyalty." "Simple loyalty," I said, "and the observation, Miss Hale, if I may be so bold, that I have not seen him this near to something like peace since before his father died, and I would count it among the great satisfactions of my own long service to see that peace secured." She looked between the two of us, the Duke and his steward. Standing in a dying garden with more honesty laid bare between us than most drawing-rooms manage in a decade, and something in her face settled, the way I imagine a scale settles once the true weight has finally been set upon it. "Very well," she said. "I accept your terms, Your Grace, though I reserve the right to renegotiate the drainage clause at length possibly for the remainder of our marriage. I would expect nothing less, my Duke said, and I saw him reach for her hand then, not to bow over it with practiced gallantry, but simply to hold it plainly in the gray autumn light, the way a man holds a hand he intends to go on holding for the rest of his life. She let him. Her fingers, I noticed, did not tremble at all, though the moment, by any fair accounting, warranted trembling. She had, I think, finally arrived at the one thing 11 years of caution had not prepared her for, the simple, unspectacular certainty of being wanted exactly as she was. They were married in the spring, at Wexmoor's own small stone chapel rather than in the county town, a decision Miss Hale, the new Duchess of Wexmoor, though I confess it took me some weeks to accustom my tongue to the title, insisted upon, on the grounds that she had spent quite enough of her life as a subject of public discussion, and preferred her wedding to belong to herself and her husband rather than to the assembled curiosity of 3 counties. I stood at the back of that small chapel, as is proper for a steward, and watched her walk the short aisle on the arm of old Prout, who had known her longest of any one remaining and had asked, with uncharacteristic gruffness, for the honor of standing in her guardian's place. Her cane struck the stone floor in its familiar rhythm, unhurried, unapologetic, and my Duke watched her come toward him with an expression I had genuinely never before seen on his face in 19 years of close observation. Not the controlled stillness I knew so well, but something entirely undefended, as though every wall he had built around his own wanting had simply come down at once, and he had decided, evidently, that he did not mind the world seeing it. I will not pretend the marriage unfolded afterward without its ordinary frictions, because I promised myself, in the writing of this account, that I would not turn 2 real, complicated people into figures in a fairy tale merely for the tidiness of the telling. They argued, as she had promised they would, over drainage and over tenants, and over the placement of a folly in the East Park that my Duke considered an eyesore and my Duchess considered, with some justice, a rather good joke at the expense of his excessive practicality. She won, I will note, considerably more than half of these arguments, which pleased my Duke rather more than it might have pleased a lesser man's pride. He was called, within the first year of their marriage, to defend her at a county dinner from a matron foolish enough to suggest, within earshot, that the Duchess's leg must make the running of so large a household a trial for her, and I have rarely seen him colder or more precisely furious than he was in the 3 minutes it took him to make that woman regret the sentence for the remainder of the evening, without once raising his voice above the pitch appropriate to polite company. My Duchess, for her part, required no defense of the kind that treats a woman as fragile. She had dismantled the matron herself, in fact, before my Duke had finished crossing the room, with a single dry observation about the difference between a weak leg and a weak character that left the woman with nothing further to say, and the rest of the table considerably more entertained than sympathetic. He arrived, I think, mostly to stand beside her rather than to rescue her, which I have come to believe is the entire distinction between the courtship he offered and the pity every prior suitor had failed to disguise as something better. I remained steward at Wexmoor through all of it, through the birth of their first child, a daughter with her mother's directness and her father's stillness in equal, occasionally alarming measure, through the slow mending of the east wing roof, financed in the end by a scheme of the Duchess's own devising that turned a portion of the estate's underused land to a purpose so sensible and so profitable that my Duke conceded, with the particular grace of a man who has learned to enjoy losing an argument to his wife, that marrying her had been the single most financially prudent decision of his tenure, quite apart from any other consideration. Through the ordinary passage of years that turn a courtship into a marriage and a marriage into something quieter, and, I have come to believe, considerably sturdier than the romances the county gossips prefer to imagine for their own entertainment. I think often of the old Earl, dead now these many years, and of the plain, unglamorous shrewdness of that final paragraph in his will. He did not command his ward to marry, and would not have, being far too wise a man to believe love could be legislated into being by a lawyer's clause. He only said what he had observed from a distance, over years of quiet attention that neither of the two people he was observing had ever suspected him of paying. That here were two people who fit each other, if only someone would hand them the courage to find out. He gave them nothing but permission, and it turned out in the end to be exactly the gift they needed and no more, because a courtship built on anything less honest than two people's own plain wanting would never have survived the ordinary weather of an actual marriage. I have told this story many times over the years, to underfootmen curious about the portrait of the old Earl that hangs still in the Wexmore Gallery, and to my own grandchildren, who like best the part where the Duchess demolished the matron at the county dinner before her husband could finish crossing the room. But the part I return to most in my own private accounting of it is the walk in the Thornfield garden, the frost on the dying roses, and the sound of my Duke's voice telling a woman who had spent 11 years being left that he had watched her, wanted her, and intended, God and drainage schemes willing, to go on wanting her for the whole of his life. I have served a great house and a great name for the better part of my working years, and I will tell you plainly, as my Duke and Duchess have always preferred plain things told plainly, I have never once, in all that service, witnessed anything I considered finer than that. I have not yet told you properly of Mrs. Dunmore, and I think I ought to, because she played a larger part in the courtship than either the Duke or the Duchess ever fully credited her for, and a good steward's account is incomplete if it forgets the servants who did the quiet work of watching over a thing too fragile in its early days to survive careless handling. Mrs. Dunmore had been housekeeper at Thornfield since Miss Hale was a girl of 8, newly arrived and frightened and limping badly from the fever that had only just released its grip on her leg, and she had appointed herself, without any authority beyond her own affection, a kind of second guardian to the child. In all the small matters, a busy old Earl could not be expected to notice. It was Mrs. Dunmore who had sat up with her through the worst of the early years, when other children's cruelty about the cane cut deeper than any fever had, and it was Mrs. Dunmore who had told her, more than once, in words plainer than a housekeeper is generally permitted to use with her betters, that any man who could not see past a walking stick to the woman holding it was not a man worth the grieving. She did not trust my Duke at first. I learned this from her own mouth, below stairs, over a pot of the strong tea she kept for herself, and no one else, in the weeks after the funeral when the courtship was still new and unproven. Dukes, she told me, with the particular scorn of a woman who had buried 2 husbands of her own and outlived her illusions about the aristocracy along with them, are accustomed to having whatever they point at, Mr. Fitch, and I'll not stand by and watch my girl handed over like a parcel, because a dying man's will made it fashionable. I told her what I had seen, the ledgers, the plain question answered plainly, the 2 years of silent watching that had cost my Duke rather more than he ever admitted aloud. She listened with her arms folded and her mouth set in the skeptical line I came to know well over the following weeks, and she made her own inquiries besides, in the way housekeepers always do, through the servants' hall network that misses nothing of importance in a great house, however carefully its masters imagine their affairs to be private. It was Mrs. Dunmore in the end, who came to me a fortnight before the wedding with her arms still folded but her face considerably softened, and said only, "He asked Cook yesterday what the Duchess prefers for her breakfast, and when Cook told him eggs and toast, plain, he said that was very sensible of her and asked for nothing grander to be prepared. Said she'd not thank anyone for fussing over her tastes just because she'd got a title to go with them. That is not the behavior of a man collecting a prize, Mr. Fitch. That is the behavior of a man who has troubled himself to learn what a woman actually likes, rather than what he imagines a duchess ought to like." She had sniffed then, in the manner of a woman not accustomed to admitting she had been wrong, and added, I'll allow he may do after all. I have always thought that endorsement, grudging and hard one as it was, meant more to the match's eventual happiness than any speech either the Duke or the old Earl ever made, because Mrs. Dunmore was not a woman given to sentiment, and a household servants know its master's true characters better than any drawing-room acquaintance ever could. She stood at the back of the small stone chapel on the wedding day, near enough to me that I heard her blow her nose with unusual vigor during the vows, and when I glanced at her, she pretended fiercely that she had not been crying at all, which of course she had, and which I never once mentioned to her afterward, out of the same discretion I try to bring to every account I keep. There is a coda to this account that I feel obliged to set down, since a steward's honesty extends to the small truths as much as the large ones. Some 2 years into the marriage, when the Duchess was newly carrying their second child, and the estate had settled into the particular rhythm that marks a household finally at ease with itself, I came upon her alone in the Wexmore library one wet afternoon, seated near the window with a stack of the old Earl's letters in her lap. Prute had sent them on, the last of the estate's correspondence, some months after the funeral, and she had only now found the composure to read them properly. "Mr. Fitch," she said, looking up, "I have found something you should see, I think, before I show my husband, since you were there at the reading and will understand its weight better than most." She held out a letter, dated some 3 years before the Earl's death, addressed to no one, unsent, a private accounting the old man had apparently kept for himself, the sort of document a man writes when he wishes to clarify his own thinking rather than persuade another's. I read it there by the window light. In it the Earl had set down, in his own dry hand, the whole of his reasoning long before any illness forced his final will into being, that he had watched the young Duke of Wexmore at church and at market, and at the scattered assemblies of the county for years, and had seen in him a loneliness the boy disguised so well that most of the county mistook it for pride, that he had watched his own ward grow into a woman of formidable sense, whom the county's fools kept mistaking for a burden rather than recognizing as its finest asset, and that he had privately resolved, long before any diagnosis gave his resolution urgency, that if the two of them had not found their own way to each other by the time his own health failed, he would use whatever leverage a dying man's affection could still command to at least open the door between them, though he would never, he wrote, force either of them through it against their own will. He knew, the Duchess said quietly, watching me read, for years, long before he was ill. He simply waited to see if we would manage it ourselves, and when we didn't, he gave us the smallest possible push he could devise, one that left the choosing entirely to us. "That sounds very like him, Your Grace," I said, and found my own voice less steady than I would have liked. He was never a man to command what he could instead persuade, and never a man to persuade what he could instead simply illuminate, and let two sensible people see the truth of it themselves. "I miss him," she said simply, "more than I let myself say aloud most days." "So do I, Your Grace," I told her, "though I knew him rather less well than you did, and only through your husband's account of a friendship between two fathers that outlasted both their lifetimes in the end, in the shape of the two of you." She folded the letter carefully and set it back among the others, and I left her there by the window, the rain still falling soft against the glass, and went to find my Duke, because I thought, on reflection, that he would want to know of it before the day was out, and because some truths, once uncovered, are best not left to wait even a single unnecessary hour before they are shared with the person who has earned the comfort of them. That, I think, is as fitting a place as any to close this account. A dying man's quiet, unglamorous kindness, patient enough to wait years and humble enough to offer only a door rather than a command. A duke who mistook his own longing for a discourtesy he had no right to inflict, until permission set him free to speak it. And a woman who had built an entire fortress out of expecting to be left, only to discover, at the one door she had least expected to open, a man who had no intention of leaving at all. I have served this house the whole of my working life, and if you ask me what I count as its finest achievement, I would not point you to its rents or its roofs or even its roses, restored now and thriving in the same beds where a duke once made his case among the frost. I would point you to the simple fact, observable any evening you care to look, of two people at their own fireside, arguing companionably over some small matter of drainage or accounts, entirely unbothered by what the county thinks of either of them, and entirely, unmistakably, at home in each other's company. That, I have come to believe, is the whole of what a good marriage is asked to be, and I have had the privilege, these many years, of watching one built exactly so, one plain and honest sentence at a time.